In this video, I'm going to discuss how I settled on the Fujifilm X system for my photography business. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Dylan Golby and welcome to another gear short slash possibly slightly longer than regular gear short. In this week's video, I want to discuss a question that I get asked quite a bit. I've got it in email a few times. I've had it on various posts that I've made online, and also from people that I meet who sort of look at me and say, "Wow, Fujifilm still make cameras? Are they any good? Are they, everybody uses Canon or Sony. Is this a decent camera for professional photography?" And so the question that I get quite a bit is Fujifilm X up to the task? Is it good enough for professional photography? And rather than give a simple curt answer of sort of, yes, of course it is, I use it in my business, or, no, it's not a great system and I'm looking to change, I thought I would dig a little deeper into how it is that I decided to use Fujifilm for my business, where I feel like it falls short, and where I feel like it excels. And so I'm not going to be getting into specific camera body and sensor comparisons or specific lens comparisons. That would be a never-ending discussion and really only helpful to somebody who perhaps wanted my set of lenses. So what I'm going to try and do today is provide a little bit of a framework for looking at a system and whether it will meet your needs and the needs of your clients. Before we get started though, there are a few caveats here. The first one is that we're going to be talking about the wants and needs of quote-unquote professional photographers. We are not talking about the wants and needs of amateur photographers here, so keep that in mind as we go forward. The second thing is that we're not going to be talking about video at all. The only video that I really produce is the video for this YouTube channel. I'm not in a place to discuss the different features of different video cameras. There are plenty of people out there who will do a much better job of it than me. And the third thing is that we all have different wants and needs. We all have different systems that we like or that we are, bought into. And I'd like to keep the comments as respectful as possible. I don't want to have another one of these flame wars that we see on the internet about which camera is better than which camera. If you have something that you like, feel free to let us know, but know that other people are going to be making different choices than you. So just what is professional photography? Well, I'm going to define it as any type of photography that is done for meaningful gain. So money received from a client. It's not photography that's done for you, it's done for somebody else and you're paid to do it. So that could be photojournalism, it could be selling landscape prints, it could be event photography, wedding photography, family photography, it could be commercial photography. So as you can see, there's a whole lot of different types of professional photography, and so defining that a camera is good for professional photography is a little bit of a short-sighted way of looking at it. So we need to expand a little bit and sort of decide what are the things that a professional needs for a specific type of photography. So for example, an architecture photographer may need a tilt shift lens, whereas if you are a run-and-gun family photographer, a tilt-shift lens is just going to get in the way. So that's a consideration when you're starting to look at different systems. For the rest of this video, I'm going to continue posing that question and giving you the answer from my perspective in the hopes that the thought process will be useful to you. So where am I coming from? Well, let's take a look at my business from a bit of a macro perspective. Now, over the course of each year, I typically photograph somewhere between 50 and 100 corporate events, and those vary in length from a couple of hours to a few days long. I also photograph about the same number of families, so somewhere between 50 and 100 families every year. I also have a few couple sessions, so I'll be working with young couples on their pre-wedding shoots. I also do a little bit of travel editorial here and there, which takes me to various parts of Korea or all over Asia, and I also photograph the brand new excavators for Volvo construction equipment. So taking all of that into account, I'm typically photographing 100,000 or more images a year. I'm also on airplanes, trains, buses, all the time with my equipment. I walk to some of my sessions, and most of my sessions involve, a lot of walking around. So considering all of this, what are my requirements for a camera system? Well, I need something that's going to perform in all conditions. So whether it's hot, cold, rainy, sunny, doesn't really matter. I need the camera to be able to perform. The second thing that I need is, the right amount of resolution. I don't need too much resolution, but I can't get away with a 6 megapixel camera anymore. Clients want a little bit more than that. I also need a good selection of lenses, specifically fast primes, which we'll get into soon. I need decent ISO performance to get me by in the dark situations of things like corporate events. And I also need it to be fairly lightweight because I'm going to be carrying it over long distances at any given shoot. The final things that I need are reliable autofocus and fairly good colors coming straight out of the camera, and we'll talk about that when we get to that section. For me, the size and weight of my kit is a very important consideration, as all of my work is done on location and my cameras are always carried on my body. So for a given corporate event, I might walk anywhere up to 10 or 20 kilometers in a day. And with my family sessions, I'm going to be walking to that location, playing with my family, and then walking back again. And I don't want to, for any of my clients, be tired when I arrive, be unable to give my best because my gear is weighing me down. Now, when I started in photography, I actually started with the behemoth that is the D800. I also had a D750, and these cameras are heavy, but what's even heavier is the lenses that come along with them. These huge full-frame lenses tend to be a lot heavier than their APS-C counterparts, and so when I moved over to the Fujifilm system, I was no longer tired at the end of every day. I no longer had to get a shoulder massage to sort myself out after a long corporate event. The Fujifilm system brought about a much easier way for me to work, and there weren't really any trade-offs for that. So while mirrorless cameras have definitely made things a little bit lighter, I did a quick search around to have a look at some of the full frame options, and it seems that it's still about 25 or 50% more weight for the equivalent kit that I carry with my Fujifilm bodies. And for me, that's just going to make things a little bit too much in certain situations. And so that's a huge consideration for me, but maybe if you're not moving around so much, or maybe if you have a car to drive to your locations or your sessions aren't so long, it won't be such a huge problem for you. Next up is the colors that come straight out of the camera. Now, good colors are a very subjective idea. What you think are good colors and what I think are good colors, very different things, and that's fine. What Canon thinks are good colors, what Nikon thinks are good colors, what Fujifilm thinks are good colors, and what Sony thinks are good colors. Very, very different things. And if you're somebody who likes to get this into post-production and spend a good amount of time pushing and pulling the image in all sorts of directions, then this may not even be a consideration for you. However, for me, one thing that's really important is getting the image as close to what I'm going to deliver in camera as possible. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The first is I don't really enjoy post-production. I'm not the sort of person who's going to sit there finessing a color wheel. I don't enjoy doing it. The second thing is I deliver so many images to so many different clients, as you heard before, over the course of a year, that if I were to spend 15 or 20 minutes on each image, I'd never get any sleep and I'd never get any images delivered. Very bad for business. So for me, Fujifilm gets me the closest to the type of colors that I like to provide for my clients. And so I'm really happy to keep using this because basically it reduces my workload. So whether or not that's a consideration for you is going to be a very personal one, but if you have the opportunity, maybe try to get raw files from all these different cameras and just take a look at them. Which one gets you closest to what you want to do, and is that something that you value? Autofocus. Now, this one is a contentious one, and it seems to have almost become the new megapixel war of the DSLR days. Now, does your camera track the eye of somebody moving at half the speed of light when it only takes up 1% of the frame? Or is it able to, I don't know, find the left wing of a hummingbird in flight? I jest a little bit, but this is sort of the discussion as it sounds to me. Like, honestly, the new autofocus systems are all pretty fantastic. It's a case of sort of comparing each one of them and deciding whether you need those specific features, whether you need that extra little bit of speed. If you compare Sony to Fujifilm to Canon to Nikon, you're going to see different implementations of achieving the same goal, which is to get the lens to focus light in the way that you want it to as quickly as possible. And so when you look at something like Sony, they're typically on the bleeding edge of what is possible right now, and people have come to really, really like that. But the question that I want to ask is that really useful to you in your business? While it might be nice to have slightly faster autofocus, the ability to track faces better, the ability to track cars, birds, motorcycles, things like that, and I often look at some of these other camera companies or the cameras that friends and colleagues are using and think, wow, the grass is a little bit greener over there. Fujifilm is not on the bleeding edge of autofocus technology. I then take a step back and think, well, am I missing photos for my clients? Am I not able to focus for my clients? Is my landscape photography suffering, my personal photography suffering, because the autofocus doesn't do A or B that Canon, Nikon, Sony does? And the answer is pretty much no all of the time. So for me, that little 5 or 10% extra autofocus performance really isn't that important most of the time. For me, Fujifilm tracks running children with absolutely no problem, and it focuses in candlelit rooms at corporate events. So for me, it covers all the bases that I need. Having said that, there are a couple of things that I would like to see in future Fujifilm bodies, and the first one of those is a slightly better face detection algorithm. Right now it tends to find faces in trees and walls just as often as it finds them in people. It's also a little bit difficult to select between faces when you have multiple people in a scene and you want to be able to select just one of them. It would be great to maybe have a closest face to me option where it would automatically select that, or for group shots, maybe the face that's in the middle so you get that most depth of field. Just small settings like that that we could add to an already fairly good system would make it a lot more usable. I'd also like to see a really good single point tracking system. So right now when I'm using AFC, I still rely on the area box, so a little square of 9 focus points that basically tracks whatever's in it, because I can't really trust that single point focus to stick on something and move around and follow it. So seeing improvements in those areas would be good for me, but honestly they would just make my life a little bit easier. They wouldn't improve my photography in any significant way. So again, what you need in terms of autofocus might be very different from what I need. You might be a landscape photographer who manual focuses, in which case it's a complete non-issue for you, not something you even need to consider. You might be somebody who is out trying to capture rare birds in flight, in which case you probably want the best autofocus you can possibly get, maybe with sort of an animal detection mode that will allow you to focus through leaves and things in the forest. Definitely worth considering which of these systems is important for your photography, not just trying to get the best of the best if you're not actually going to use it. As I mentioned earlier in the video, ISO performance is a consideration for me because I do work in some quite dark environments and I often have to ramp my ISO up just to get images. Now, 15 years ago, an APS-C sensor might have been a no-no for these dark environments, but technology has advanced and they are now quite good. Perhaps not quite as good as the bleeding edge of full-frame sensors, which tend to get a lot of research and development money thrown at them, but when it comes to the Fujifilm X system, I've still yet to have one client turn around and say, whew, there's a lot of noise in those images, and not be able to use them. You still get very, very good noise performance. You get plenty of detail and good color rendition from these cameras. Now, it might not be the absolute best, so if you are someone who's going to be maybe doing weddings and you routinely need ISO 6400 or 12800, then maybe you want to look at a full frame camera with some really fast glass to be able to get the best possible performance. But for the type of work that I do, the Fujifilm X-T3 and X-T4 are plenty. I've mentioned the megapixel war once already, and it seems like we're about to enter another one, and this time around it's not going to be 6, 12 or 20 megapixels, it's going to be 40, 50, 100 megapixels. And so we're starting to see rumors of full-frame mirrorless systems producing 80 and 100 megapixel sensors, and so people are obviously wanting resolution, or camera companies wouldn't be making it, but just how much do we actually need for our professional work? Now, I'm going to show you right now a sample from my personal work, just to give you an idea of the sort of requirements for megapixels that we have. Now, this image was shot on a Fujifilm X-T10. That is a 16 megapixel X-Trans sensor, and if you look at the size of this thing, I'm 180 centimeters tall, and that print is probably 4 or 5 times my height, and it looks just fine. I couldn't see a pixel, I couldn't see any extra grain. The reason for that is viewing distance. Now, photographers tend to like to look quite close and see how much detail they've captured or whether their images are in focus, and it can throw you off a little bit when you look at a digital file and see all these little squares when you zoom in, and then you think, wow, if I had that 100 megapixel GFX, I wouldn't have that problem. You will, you'll just have to zoom in a little bit further, and the large prints you make can be viewed a little bit closer. That's really the only difference we're going to see with higher megapixel cameras. So what's important for you? Are you going to be making building-sized prints that are going to be viewed up close? Does a client of yours have a requirement for 50 or 100 megapixels? Or are you shooting weddings where nobody's ever going to print anything larger than maybe a 20 by 30 to hang on the wall in their house? Those are the sorts of things that you want to consider when you're considering how many megapixels you actually need. Now, how many megapixels you want is a very different thing. You might want to zoom in and have a look around, and that's just fine. But how many you actually need for professional use is not that many, to be honest, for most things. So onto the current crop of Fujifilm cameras. For my work, I don't really need all that much resolution. My families will often print small prints for their mantelpiece at home or make books to, commemorate trips to Korea and things like that. My corporate clients will put things on Instagram and Facebook to advertise the events that they've had. My magazine clients will be printing in a standard magazine size, so they don't need any more than about 6 or 8 megapixels anyway. And so for the most part, I don't need any more resolution, and I'm completely happy with the 26 megapixels that we have in the X-T3 and the X-T4. The only time that I think maybe I would like a little bit more resolution, maybe 32 megapixels would be really good, is when I'm shooting with families and it's a really high-paced situation and I don't really have the time to perfect the composition of every single shot that I'm taking. Maybe the kids are running around, or parents have thrown their child up in the air and I didn't realize quite how high that child was going to go. It would be nice to be able to shoot a little bit looser, a little bit wider, and crop in and still know that I'm going to have plenty of detail. Now, with 26 megapixels, any digital image is going to be absolutely fine, but if these parents come back to me and they say, oh, we printed a 20 by 30 because we really loved that shot, and it's a bit soft, it's kind of like I can't really see my child, he's got a bit pixelated, then I would like to have a little bit of extra resolution to be able to do that. But otherwise, the resolution is absolutely fine for the things that I do. Now, if you're doing high-end architectural work or commercial work, you might need a higher resolution camera. And as I said in the beginning, I do a little bit of commercial work for Volvo construction equipment. And at those shoots, I use the GFX 100 because we need as much detail as possible for certain applications that they have. Depth of field. Now, this is a rabbit hole that can get very, very technical very, very quickly. And also when we start talking about the result of shallow depth of field, the blur in the background or the bokeh and the quality of that, it can also become a very emotional discussion. But we're not really going to look at either of those today. What I do want to talk about is maybe dispelling a little bit of a myth that you can't really get shallow depth of field with smaller sensors. Now, while it may be true that for a given focal length at a given aperture and a given distance, a larger sensor will produce shallower depth of field, there are equivalent lenses for different systems that will allow you to get very shallow depth of field on those systems. Now, of course, there is the sweet spot in the current technology that seems to be the full frame sensors. So if you want that absolute shallowest depth of field, perhaps getting a Canon R with, say, the 85mm f1.2 will give you that absolute razor thin depth of field that you might be looking for, and probably some beautiful bokeh to go with it. However, that's not to say that something like the Fujifilm X-T4 can't produce extremely shallow depth of field and very nice bokeh with some of the lenses that Fujifilm offers. So let's take a quick look at an image right here. Now, this image here is shot with the XF23mm f1.4, and the main contributors to that very shallow depth of field are my proximity to the subject and the use of the wide open f1.4 aperture. Now, honestly, I don't think there's a need for any shallower depth of field than what I'm getting here. At this point, Dad is almost completely out of focus anyway. We can barely recognize him, and I think going any shallower wouldn't really help the image. And for most of my work, that is the case. I don't typically find that I'm limited by the depth of field that I'm getting. In fact, the opposite is often true with the APS-C sensors in the Fujifilm X series. When it comes to slightly low light where you might want to freeze motion, you can often use a wider aperture to get that same depth of field while still getting a fast shutter speed using a low ISO. Now, these are not extremely common situations, and the depth of field that you get from a given aperture I don't think is really one of the considerations that I would put into choosing the camera system that I'm going to work with as a professional. The lenses that are available for a given system should possibly be one of your biggest considerations when you're saying, well, is this good for professional use? Now, if you think about the Fujifilm X-T system, the resolution might be a little bit low for architectural photography, but one of the biggest things that's missing is actually a tilt-shift lens. Now, sure, there are some third-party adapters that you can use to bring in other lenses from other systems, but there is not a high-quality Fujifilm tilt-shift lens that's available for this system. And so for, a professional architectural photographer, this might be just a thing that won't even be considered. The Fujifilm X system is completely out for something like that. Being a portrait photographer, Fujifilm covers pretty much everything that I could need, and I would say that that's true for most genres of photography. Fujifilm has their trio of extremely high quality pro-grade zooms, the f2.8 zooms. You also have a whole lot of fast prime lenses, differing options. So you have f1.4 lenses, you have f2 lenses, depending on your needs. You also have some fairly extreme zooms that might be used for certain types of professional photography, like bird photography. You've got a 100 to 400, and I believe there's a 150 to 600 or something like that on the way as well. So there are definitely lenses to cover pretty much all of the requirements for a professional. Having said that, the one thing that is missing from the lens lineup of Fujifilm is a good selection of off-brand autofocus lenses. Now, with Sony, Canon, Nikon, these are companies that have a very large customer base, and so these third-party lens manufacturers, people like Sigma and Tamron, have produced a good selection of offerings for those mounts at a slightly lower price point and with very, very good quality. Now, the Fujifilm system hasn't really had that, and hopefully we're going to start seeing that over the next year or two. But that might be a consideration for people. You might think to yourself, well, I can get a full-frame camera with lenses that are cheaper than Fujifilm's APS-C ones and just as good quality for less money. Fujifilm's lenses, while not expensive, are all on brand, and so they are a little bit more expensive than what third-party competition might provide. One final but very important point that I want to talk about from the perspective of professional photographers is dependability and reliability of the camera system that you choose. Now, as a professional, you are expected to show up, shoot, and deliver files. Now, at any point during that process, if your camera, your lens, or your memory cards decide to just fail on you, then you're probably not going to get invited back, and you won't be a professional photographer for much longer. So you really need cameras that can show up and do the job. Now, when I first got into the Fujifilm system, I had the X-T1, and then I went to the X-T2, and I had some X-T10s and X-T20s. Those are cameras that were still finding their footing in terms of their reliability and their build quality. I had a couple of broken screens and buttons that just stopped working on the X-T1 and the X-T2. Actually, I still have my X-T2. Those buttons sometimes have to be pressed a couple of times. Now, I haven't really had those issues with the X-T3 and the X-T4. They've also started to feel a little bit more solid. One of the things that really bugged me in the beginning when I got my X-T1 was I was coming from the D800, which I'm pretty sure is built on technology from Soviet-era tanks. These are essentially, they're indestructible. Whereas the X-T1 and the X-T2 felt a little bit more, despite the talk about weather sealing and the materials used in construction, they felt a lot more like toys. And it's very difficult to trust something that feels like a toy. Now the X-T3 and the X-T4 have fixed that a lot. They feel a lot more solid in the hand, and I can say I haven't had any failing buttons or failing screens on those particular cameras. They've been really, really good. So I would say that I'm confident to use the X-T3 and the X-T4 in any situation, any weather. So my take on that is to consider how much you shoot in certain situations. So for example, me, I just need a camera that can basically be put through anything. On my travel editorial, it might be a typhoon one day and then sunny the next, so I need something that is weather sealed and dependable in those situations. I also need a camera that has a dependable shutter, so something that's going to stand up to 100, 200,000 frames a year and still last me until at least the point where the next model comes out and I come to the point where I need to replace that camera. I also need a camera that can take a few knocks, so a plastic body is probably not something that I'm going to go to. You know, composite materials are something that are a little bit more durable and will, you know, work for the type of photography that I do. So if you're a little bit more cautious and a little bit more slow-paced in the work that you do, then you probably don't need that extra durability that I need for my work. If you're also only shooting maybe 5,000 or 10,000 images a year, you're doing still lifes, or you're doing, you know, commercial work where there's not a lot of photography being done at each particular session, then maybe you don't need that super durable shutter. So something worth considering is whether you actually need all of these little bits and pieces when you go to look for a camera system. And in my case, the Fujifilm X system, specifically the X-T3 and the X-T4, do a really good job and have never failed me so far. Okay, so that has been a long one. To anybody who made it to the end, congratulations. I hope that it's been useful to you. I hope that it's given you a few things to think about if you're considering what system you might need or whether you should change to another system for your particular brand of professional photography. Again, I don't think all these considerations are as serious for amateur photographers or hobbyist photographers as they are for professionals, as nobody's really paying you for those images. You don't really need to meet their demands. The only demands imposed on you are self-imposed, and you can be a little bit more flexible with those than, say, with somebody who's paying you to do things. So in conclusion, while the Fujifilm X system may not be the absolute industry leader in lots of different technical metrics, it definitely performs well enough for the type of work that I do and gets me through my day-to-day professional work and allows me to create the images that my clients want. And that's what makes it a good enough system for my brand of professional photography. So thank you guys again for watching. Thank you for getting this far in what is a very, very long video. If you haven't already, please do give this video a thumbs up. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think about the system that you're using and whether you've ever considered changing. Also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. I've also put a couple of other videos here that you might want to watch if you've enjoyed this one. Cheers, and see you in the next one.